Tonight I want to tell you about a woman named Evangeline, a woman her town called Barren, a woman her husband called worthless, a woman who was about to be sold like cattle. But when a mysterious Comanche warrior appeared in the dead of night, he offered her a choice between the hell she knew and a wild, dangerous freedom she couldn't possibly imagine. What happened next is a story of survival, revenge, and a secret so dark it would unravel everything she thought she knew about her own life. And it proves that sometimes the thing they try to break you with is the very thing that sets you free. The sun in Cedar Ridge, Texas, didn't just shine, it baked. It cooked the dust on the main street into a fine brown powder that got into your clothes, your throat, your soul. For Evangeline Mali, that dust felt like the ashes of her own life, settling over everything. She walked out of the general store, her basket of meager supplies feeling heavier than it should. Her hair, a shocking cascade of auburn red, caught the light, and for a moment she was beautiful. Porcelain skin, eyes the color of a frozen lake. At 25, she looked like a painting someone had mistakenly left out in the harshness of the frontier. But in Cedar Ridge, beauty was a currency with no value. A woman's worth was counted in the number of sons she could give her husband. And Evangeline's womb was silent. "There she goes," a voice hissed from the porch of the church. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose face was a permanent roadmap of disapproval. The barren Molly girl. 3 years with poor Thomas and not a thing to show for it. It's a curse, I tell you. Evangeline's knuckles went white around the handle of her basket. The words were like tiny, sharp stones thrown at her back. She'd learned to ignore them, the way you learn to ignore the constant hum of flies on a hot day. But ignoring them didn't stop them from landing. It didn't stop them from stinging. Her house stood at the edge of town, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. It was supposed to be a home filled with laughter, with the pitter-patter of small feet. Now it was just a box, a prison of failed expectations. Thomas was on the porch, of course, slumped in a rocker, the sour smell of cheap whiskey clinging to him like a second skin. He didn't look at her as she approached. His eyes, once a warm hazel that had made her heart flutter, were now dull and flat, like river stones. "The whole town's talking again," he mumbled, his words thick and clumsy. He gestured at her stomach with a lazy, contemptuous wave of his hand. "Doc Miller's wife just popped out her fourth? A boy. And you're still empty." The word hung in the air. Empty. A hollow space where a life should have been. "Thomas, please," she started, but he cut her off, lurching to his feet. "Please what, Evangeline?" he sneered. "Pray harder? Try again? I've done my part. A man can only do so much. The problem, my dear wife, isn't with me." Each word was a carefully aimed blow. She'd heard them all before, in different combinations, at different volumes, but they never lost their power to shatter a little piece of her. A woman who couldn't conceive wasn't just a disappointment. In this world she was broken, defective goods. He leaned in closer, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. "The big cattle drive comes through next week," he said, and his eyes had a cold, calculating glint she'd never seen before. It terrified her. "Jim Patterson's been asking after you." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Jim Patterson, a greasy, pig-eyed man in his 50s, with hands like shovels and a reputation for cruelty that was whispered about even in a town as rough as Cedar Ridge. Evangeline's breath hitched. "What? What about him?" Thomas smiled. It was a broken, ugly thing. "He says he doesn't mind damaged goods, if the price is right." Her blood ran cold. The dust on the street, the peeling paint, the whispers, it all coalesced into a single horrifying reality. He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just disappointed. He was going to sell her. The thought was so monstrous, so utterly unthinkable, that her mind refused to accept it. "You can't be serious," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Dead serious," Thomas spat, his face twisting with a resentment so deep it seemed to have carved canyons into his soul. "You're no wife to me. You're a decoration, a useless, pretty thing that can't do the one job God put women on this earth for. This way, at least I get something out of the deal. Patterson's paying off my debts at the saloon. It's a clean slate. For me. He turned and stumbled back inside, leaving her on the porch as the merciless sun beat down. The world tilted on its axis. She wasn't his wife. She was his property, his collateral, and her debt was coming due. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the open window, listening to Thomas's drunken snores from the other room, and stared out at the vast, dark prairie. It stretched on forever, a sea of whispering grass under a blanket of stars. Out there was danger, wildness, the unknown. But for the first time, it didn't look like a threat. It looked like an escape. She thought of her mother, who had died when she was just a girl, leaving behind a small leather journal filled with pressed wildflowers and stories of a life lived for passion, not for duty. Had any of that courage been passed down to her, or had it been bleached out by years of shame and failure? Just as that thought crossed her mind, a movement on the horizon caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but then they came into focus. A group of riders moving with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly alien. They weren't cowboys. They rode bareback on horses painted with strange symbols, their long, dark hair flowing freely in the night breeze. Comanche. Her heart began to hammer in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. Every story she'd ever heard was a nightmare of raids, of fire, of violence. She should have run, she should have screamed, but she was frozen, mesmerized by the sight. There was a raw power to them, a sense of belonging to the land that the people of Cedar Ridge, with their fences and their wooden houses, could never possess. Then one rider broke away from the group. He moved his horse closer to her house, coming to a stop just beyond the flimsy picket fence. Even in the dim light, he was magnificent. Tall, with shoulders so broad, they seemed to block out the stars behind him. His chest was bare, his skin the color of dark honey, and feathers were woven into his long black hair. He sat on his horse not like a man riding an animal, but like they were two parts of a single, perfect being. He looked up, straight at her window, and their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. His gaze wasn't filled with the pity or contempt she saw every single day. There was no judgment in those dark, intelligent eyes. He just saw her, not the barren wife, not the broken thing, just a woman in a window, Evangeline. The moment stretched, taut and electric, and in that moment, something inside her, something that had been curled up and dying for years, stirred. It was a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. Hope. Then as quickly as they appeared, the warrior turned his horse, rejoined his group, and they melted back into the darkness, leaving only silence and the scent of sage on the night air. Evangeline stayed at the window until the first pale fingers of dawn clawed at the horizon. Had she dreamed it? A desperate fantasy cooked up by a mind at the end of its rope? But when the sun came up, she saw them, faint but unmistakable in the dust just beyond their fence, the tracks of unshod ponies. It was real, and somehow in the deepest part of her soul, she knew her life had just been split in two. The life before she saw him, and whatever was coming next. The next 3 days were a special kind of hell. Thomas, smelling Patterson's money, became even more brazen in his cruelty. He paraded her through town like a prize mare he was taking to market, pointing out her fine teeth and strong back to his cronies at the saloon, who laughed and slapped him on the shoulder. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed. Now there was a cruel anticipation in them, a morbid curiosity. They were all waiting to see the transaction completed. The final straw came on the third day. Jim Patterson himself cornered her in the general store, blocking her path with his massive, greasy bulk. He smelled of sweat and stale tobacco. He reached out and grabbed a lock of her hair, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. Fiery, he grunted, his pig-like eyes roaming over her body. I like fiery. Gives a man a challenge. Don't you worry, little thing. I'll tame you. We'll get a son out of you yet, one way or another. The shopkeeper, Mr. Abernathy, just looked down at his counter, suddenly fascinated by a speck of dust. No one said a word. No one helped. In their eyes, this was justice. This was the natural order of things. A useless woman being passed on to someone who might find a use for her. That night, something inside Evangeline finally snapped. The years of quiet suffering, of turning the other cheek, of absorbing their scorn, it was over. She waited until Thomas was in a drunken stupor, snoring like a felled beast at the kitchen table. With trembling hands, she gathered her few treasures, her mother's journal, a small silver locket, and the turquoise bird. She wrapped them in a shawl and slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows. She wasn't running to the warrior. She didn't even know if he was still there. She was just running, away, from the whispers, from Patterson, from the ghost of the life she was supposed to have. She ran toward the creek, the only landmark she knew, her bare feet flying over the cool, dusty ground. Her lungs burned and tears streamed down her face, but she didn't stop. As she burst through the line of cottonwood trees lining the creek, she stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. He was there. He stood beside his painted horse as if he had been carved from the moonlight itself. He wasn't surprised to see her. It was as if he had been waiting all along. "I am Dakota," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "You are the woman with fire in her hair and winter in her eyes." No one had ever described her like that. She was the barren girl, the disappointing wife. This man saw poetry in her. "How did you know?" she whispered, clutching her small bundle to her chest. "How did you know I would come?" A faint smile touched his lips. "I did not know," he said. "I hoped." He took a step closer, and she noticed he wasn't just looking at her. He was studying her. His eyes missed nothing. "Your man spoke of his plans in the white man's drinking house. His words were loud. His spirit is small." He had been watching. He had understood her danger before she even had. "They say I am cursed," she said, the words tumbling out, the confession she had never spoken aloud. "Broken, because my body will not make a child." Dakota's expression hardened. A flicker of something dangerous, something primal flashed in his dark eyes. "A woman's worth is not in her womb," he said, his voice fierce. "My people know this. A woman's worth is in her spirit, in her courage. You came here alone in the dark, with nothing but what you could carry. That is not the act of a broken woman. That is the act of a warrior." His words were like cool water on a burn. He was undoing years of damage with a few simple sentences. He was telling her she wasn't what they said she was. He gestured to the vast, dark prairie behind him. "Your path in that town leads only to more pain. But there is another path. With my people, you would not be judged for what your body cannot do. You would be honored for the gifts your spirit holds. You could be free." Freedom. The word was a foreign country she had only ever dreamed of visiting. "What would become of me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You would learn," he said simply. "You would find your place. Your hands, they are gentle. Perhaps you would be a healer. Your eyes, they are wise. Perhaps you would be a storyteller. Or perhaps you would simply be Evangeline. Honored, respected, safe." He reached into a pouch at his waist and held out his hand. Lying on his calloused palm was the twin to the turquoise bird she clutched in her own hand. "I carved this for you," he said, "so you would know my offer was real." He took another step, closing the distance between them. He gently took her hand, the one holding her bundle, and placed his carved bird beside her own. His touch was warm, firm, respectful. It sent a jolt of lightning through her. "The choice is yours," he said softly, his dark eyes searching hers. "Stay and let them break you, or come with me and learn how to fly." She looked back toward the faint, flickering lights of Cedar Ridge, a town of whispers, a drunken husband, a leering monster waiting to claim her. Then she looked at Dakota, at the promise of a world she couldn't imagine, a world where she might not be broken after all. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was an answer to a prayer she didn't even know she'd been praying. "Yes," she whispered, the word tasting of hope and terror. "I'll come." Without another word, Dakota lifted her onto his horse, as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her, strong and steady, as he urged the horse forward, away from the creek, away from the town, away from the life that was already a fading memory. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Evangeline felt safe. Not just safe from harm, but safe in her own skin. They rode for what felt like hours, the steady rhythm of the horse's gait a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. The prairie night was alive with sounds she'd never noticed before. The chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. It was a language she didn't understand, but for the first time, she felt like she was a part of it, not just an intruder. Just as a sliver of moon began to rise, Dakota suddenly reined in the horse, his body tensing behind her. "What is it?" she whispered. "Listen," he commanded. She strained her ears and then she heard it, faint but growing louder. The sound of shod horses moving fast, and men's voices angry and guttural. "Who is it?" she asked, her heart beginning to pound again. Dakota's voice was grim, a low rumble against her ear. "Your husband is not as drunk as he seemed, and he has brought friends." A cold dread washed over her. A posse. Thomas and Patterson. They were coming for her. Her escape had lasted less than a night. The cage door had swung open, and now it was slamming shut again. "They are following our tracks," Dakota said, his voice calm, but laced with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. He nudged the horse into a narrow, rocky wash, where the ground was hard and would leave less of a trail. "Hold on." The world became a blur of motion. Dakota urged the horse into a gallop, his knowledge of the terrain absolute. He weaved through gullies and over ridges, using the darkness as a cloak. The sounds of their pursuers grew louder, then faded, then grew louder again. It was a terrifying cat-and-mouse game, played out across the vast, unforgiving landscape. A shout echoed from a nearby ridge, closer than before. "There they are, by the crooked bluff." It was Patterson's voice. A wave of nausea rolled through her. He wouldn't just take her back. He would punish her for running. The things he would do. Her mind shied away from the images. "They are driving us toward the ravine," Dakota said, his voice tight. She could feel the coiled power in his muscles as he guided the horse. "It is a trap." Ahead of them, the ground simply vanished. A dark, gaping maw in the earth. The ravine. They were cornered. Behind them, the posse was closing in, their triumphant shouts echoing in the night. To the left and right, impassable rock walls. There was nowhere to go. This was it. Her brief, desperate flight for freedom was over. Dakota brought the horse to a skidding halt just feet from the edge. He slid off the horse and pulled her down with him, his movements swift and certain. "Stay behind me," he whispered, pushing her behind a cluster of boulders. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. The posse thundered up, their horses snorting and stamping. There were 4 of them. Thomas swaying in his saddle, his face blotchy with rage. Jim Patterson, a cruel grin splitting his face, and 2 other men from town she recognized as Patterson's thugs. "Nowhere left to run, little girl," Patterson snarled, dismounting. He held a long rifle, and he leveled it at Dakota. "Hand her over, savage. She's my property now, bought and paid for." Thomas pointed a trembling finger at Evangeline. "You whore, running off with a redskin? I'll teach you a lesson you'll never forget." Dakota didn't speak. He simply stood between them and Evangeline, a silent, deadly protector. He was 1 man against 4, 1 knife against a rifle. The odds were impossible. Patterson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think that little pig sticker is going to help you? We're going to kill you, and then we're going to take her back and—" He never finished the sentence. With a speed that defied belief, Dakota moved. He wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature. He threw his knife. It wasn't aimed at Patterson, but at a loose rock formation on the cliff face above him. The knife struck with a sharp thwack, and with a deafening roar, a shower of rocks and scree cascaded down, right onto Patterson and his men. It was chaos. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. Patterson fired his rifle wildly into the air as he was knocked off his feet. Thomas yelped like a kicked dog and fell from his saddle. In that moment of confusion, Dakota grabbed Evangeline's arm. "Now!" he yelled. He didn't run from the ravine. He ran along its edge to a spot she hadn't seen before, a narrow, almost invisible ledge that snaked its way down the cliff face. It was a path no sane person would ever take. "Trust me," he commanded and pulled her over the edge. Her world became a terrifying scramble of rock and air. Her hands were raw, her heart was in her throat, but Dakota's grip was like iron. He guided her down the treacherous path with a certainty that was born of a lifetime in these wilds. Above them, they could hear the angry, frustrated shouts of the posse. They were trapped on the wrong side of the rock slide, unable to follow. They reached the bottom of the ravine, their lungs heaving, their bodies bruised and scraped. They had escaped, but as they paused to catch their breath in the darkness, Evangeline realized a chilling truth. This wasn't just a drunken husband's anger. This was a hunt. And Jim Patterson was not the kind of man to give up. This was only the beginning. They traveled for the rest of the night and through the next day, pushing themselves to the brink of exhaustion. Dakota led them through a labyrinth of canyons and hidden trails, erasing their tracks as they went. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they crested a hill and saw it, the Comanche camp. It was nestled in a hidden valley, a collection of painted teepees beside a sparkling stream. Smoke curled from campfires, and the sounds of children laughing and dogs barking filled the air. It should have been a welcoming sight, but as they rode into the camp, the chatter died down. Every eye turned to them, to her. The faces that looked back at her were not friendly. They were filled with suspicion, with curiosity, and in some with open hostility. She was an outsider, a white woman, the enemy, an older woman with long graying braids and eyes as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's stepped forward. Her face was a beautiful tapestry of wrinkles, each one telling a story. Dakota dismounted and spoke to her in their language, his voice low and respectful. He gestured to Evangeline. The woman looked Evangeline up and down, her gaze lingering, as if she were peeling back the layers of her skin to see what lay beneath. "I am Ayana," she said, her English heavily accented but clear. "Healer of this band. Dakota says you have a warrior spirit. I do not see it. I see fear. I see sorrow. The white world has broken you." Before Evangeline could respond, another younger woman pushed her way to the front. She was beautiful, with flashing black eyes and a proud, defiant stance. She shot Evangeline a look of pure venom. "Why have you brought this woman here, Dakota?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Is one of our own not good enough for you? This is a mistake. She will bring nothing but trouble." Dakota placed a calming hand on the woman's arm. "Laughing Crow," he said gently, "her path was one of death. Now it is one of life. She will learn our ways." Laughing Crow shook off his hand. "She will never be one of us," she spat, before turning and storming away. The message was clear. She hadn't found a sanctuary. She had just traded one prison for another, one set of judgments for a new one. Ayana, the healer, motioned for Evangeline to follow her. "You will stay in my teepee," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You will work. You will learn. And we will see if Dakota was right about you, or if you are just another broken white thing." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Evangeline's life. The Comanche way was a world of unspoken rules and intricate traditions she couldn't begin to understand. Every task she was given, she failed at. She was clumsy at scraping hides, inept at beating, slow at grinding corn. Laughing Crow and her friends made sure to mock her every mistake, their laughter following her through the camp. Evangeline felt a familiar despair creeping in. She had run from a world that called her worthless, only to land in one where she had to prove she wasn't. But there was a difference. Here, there was Ayana. The old healer was a harsh teacher, her criticism blunt and unforgiving. But beneath the stern exterior, Evangeline sensed a deep well of wisdom. Ayana was teaching her about herbs, about the secret language of the prairie, how one root could cure a fever, how the leaves of another could soothe a burn. And as she worked, Evangeline began to feel a flicker of purpose. Dakota was a quiet, constant presence. He couldn't protect her from the women's scorn, but he would sit with her by the fire at night, sharing stories of his people, teaching her words in his language. He treated her not as a burden, but as an equal. And in his eyes, she saw a belief in her that she had never seen anywhere else. But something was wrong. She still felt unwell. The dizzy spells and waves of nausea she had always blamed on her unhappiness in Cedar Ridge hadn't gone away. In fact, they seemed to be getting worse. She tried to hide it, not wanting to appear weak, but Ayanna missed nothing. One evening, after a particularly bad spell of dizziness, Ayanna grabbed her wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. She studied Evangeline's face, her sharp eyes narrowed in concentration. "This is no prairie sickness," the old woman murmured, more to herself than to Evangeline. "This is old, deep." She led Evangeline into her teepee, which was filled with the pungent, earthy smell of drying herbs. She began to ask questions, strange questions, about the food she ate in Cedar Ridge, about the water she drank, about Thomas. "Your husband," Ayanna said, her gaze intense. "He drank the bitter water?" "Whiskey, yes, all the time," Evangeline replied, confused. "And you?" Ayanna pressed. "Did you drink it with him?" "No, never. But he would always pour my water for me, at every meal. He called it a husband's duty. It was the only kindness he ever showed me." Ayanna's eyes went wide. A horrifying understanding seemed to dawn on her face. She began to move frantically around the teepee, grabbing bundles of herbs, crushing them in a stone bowl, her movements urgent and precise. "What is it?" Evangeline asked, a new kind of fear creeping into her heart. Ayanna didn't answer. She mixed the herbs with water, creating a dark, foul-smelling liquid. "Drink," she commanded, holding the bowl out to Evangeline. "What is it?" "It will purge the darkness from you. Drink, now." Hesitantly, Evangeline took the bowl and drank. The liquid was bitter, vile. It burned a path down her throat. Almost immediately, her stomach rebelled. A violent wave of nausea racked her body and she began to retch, heaving up the contents of her stomach onto the dirt floor of the teepee. It went on and on, a violent, agonizing purge that left her weak and trembling. When it was over, she lay gasping on the furs, her body drenched in sweat. Ayanna was not looking at her. The old healer was on her hands and knees, sifting through the filth on the floor with a stick. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "I knew it," Ayanna whispered, her voice trembling with rage. She picked something up with the end of her stick, a tiny, almost unnoticeable speck of something dark and flaky. She held it up for Evangeline to see. "What is that?" Evangeline rasped. Ayanna's dark eyes met hers, and in them, Evangeline saw a truth so monstrous, so evil, that it would change everything. "It is called the devil's root," Ayanna said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "It grows only in the shaded gullies. It does not kill quickly. It works over years. It makes the body sick. It makes the mind weak. And it makes the womb a desert where nothing can grow." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "You were not barren, child," Ayanna said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You were being poisoned." The world dissolved into a roaring in Evangeline's ears. Poisoned. The word was an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of her reality. The dizzy spells, the nausea, the years of shame, the whispers, her failure. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed, soul-crushing lie. Thomas, it had to be Thomas, pouring her water at every meal, his one act of kindness. He hadn't just been a disappointed husband. He had been her jailer, her tormentor, the architect of her misery. He hadn't just wanted a child. He had wanted to break her, to make her so weak, so sick, so dependent that she would never have the strength to leave him. His cruelty was not a simple thing born of bitterness. It was a calculated, methodical act of evil that had spanned years. The sorrow that had lived in her heart for so long didn't just disappear. It crystallized. It transformed into something new, something cold, hard, and sharp. It became rage. A fire ignited inside her, a fire that burned away the last vestiges of the timid, broken woman from Cedar Ridge. In that moment, she was reborn. Her training with Ayanna took on a new urgency. She was no longer just a student. She was an apprentice, a devotee. She absorbed every piece of knowledge the old healer offered. She learned not just to heal, but to understand the dark side of medicine, the poisons, the venoms, their antidotes. She learned the land not as a place to live, but as an arsenal. Every plant, every root, every insect held a secret, a power she could wield. The change in her was profound. The other women in the band began to look at her differently. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a fierce determination. The clumsiness in her hands was replaced by a surgeon's precision. Laughing Crow's taunts ceased, replaced by a grudging, wary respect. Her bond with Dakota deepened into something more powerful than either of them could have imagined. He saw the fire in her, the warrior spirit that Iana had spoken of, and his respect turned to love. They were married not with the hollow words of a white preacher, but under the watchful eyes of the stars. Their vows a simple promise of mutual protection, partnership, and freedom. And then one cool autumn morning, several months after the poison had been purged from her system, it happened. The first sign. A feeling she had only ever dreamed of. A feeling she had long ago accepted she would never know. She was pregnant. When she told Dakota, the stoic warrior who had faced down death 100 times without flinching, wept. He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, his touch filled with a reverence that shook her to her core. The miracle of it was almost too much to bear. The thing her husband had used to destroy her had been a lie, and the life growing inside her was the truth. Their son was born in the spring, during a fierce thunderstorm that seemed to herald his arrival. They named him Koshi, which meant quiet strength. He had his father's dark, watchful eyes and a tuft of his mother's fiery red hair. Holding him in her arms, Evangeline felt a sense of wholeness she had never imagined possible. But the past has long claws, and it was not done with her yet. Just as their life settled into a happy rhythm, a scout returned from a long journey with disturbing news. He had passed near the white settlements and heard whispers. A man with a scarred face and a burning hatred in his eyes had been asking questions. For years, he was offering a handsome reward for any information about a red-haired woman who had disappeared into the prairie with a Comanche warrior. Jim Patterson. He hadn't forgotten. He hadn't given up. He was still hunting her. The happy bubble of her new life was pierced by a shard of ice-cold fear. Not for herself anymore, but for her son, for her husband, for the family that had given her a reason to live. The hunt was on again. 2 more years passed. 2 more sons were born. Amakia, strength of the eagle, a bold and fearless child. And Nalnish, he who works, the quiet, thoughtful one. Evangeline was no longer the outsider. She was Itama, the flame woman, a respected healer whose skills were known throughout the bands. Her teepee was a place of healing and wisdom, a sanctuary. But the shadow of Jim Patterson was a constant presence at the edge of their lives. They moved their camp often, never staying in one place for too long. Dakota and his warriors were always vigilant, their scouts always watching the horizon. They lived with a peace that was beautiful, but fragile. Then came the day the world broke. The men were on a long hunt, tracking a large herd of buffaloes several days' ride from the camp. The camp was left with only the women, the children, and a few old men. It was a warm, lazy afternoon. The children were playing in the tall grass. Evangeline was grinding herbs outside her teepee, her youngest son, Nalnish, playing at her feet. She didn't hear them until it was too late. They burst out of the trees on horseback, a dozen of them, white men, hard-faced and armed with rifles, and at their head was a figure she would never forget. Jim Patterson. His face was older, scarred now from the rock slide all those years ago, but the same piggish cruelty burned in his eyes. Panic erupted. Women screamed and grabbed their children, running for the safety of the teepees. Patterson laughed, a booming, ugly sound that echoed through the valley. "Looking for someone," he roared. "Red-haired little thing, answers to Evangeline." His eyes found her. A triumphant, possessive grin spread across his face. "There you are," he snarled. "Took me a while, but I always get what's mine." He spurred his horse forward, straight toward her. Evangeline snatched Nalnish into her arms, her mind racing. There was nowhere to run. She was surrounded. One of Patterson's men grabbed her, his rough hands bruising her arms. Another snatched Nalnish from her grasp. The boy let out a terrified cry. "Give me back my son!" Evangeline screamed, fighting against the man's grip with a fury she didn't know she possessed. Patterson dismounted and swaggered toward her. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You got no sons," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not with me, anyway. But we'll fix that." First, you're going to watch while I teach this whole camp a lesson about sheltering what belongs to me. Then you and I are going for a long, long ride." He nodded to his men. "Burn it." The raid was swift and brutal. They were not warriors, they were thugs. They kicked over cooking pots, tore through teepees, and set fire to the drying racks. But they made a mistake. They underestimated the women of the Comanche. From the chaos, Ayana emerged, her face a mask of cold rage. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but a small leather pouch. With a sharp cry, she threw its contents into the nearest fire. A cloud of thick, acrid smoke billowed out, smelling of pepper and something else. Something deeply unpleasant. The men closest to the fire began to choke and cough, their eyes streaming. It was the opening they needed. The other women, armed with knives and skinning tools, fought back with the ferocity of cornered wolves protecting their young. It wasn't a battle, it was a desperate, bloody brawl. Evangeline saw her chance. The man holding her was distracted by the smoke. She stomped down on his instep with all her might. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. She twisted free, grabbed a burning piece of wood from the fire, and slammed it into his face. He staggered back, screaming, clutching his eyes. She ran toward Patterson, who still held her son. Nalnish was crying, reaching for her. "Let him go, Patterson," she screamed. He just laughed. "You got fire, I'll give you that. It'll be fun breaking you." But then he stopped laughing. His eyes went wide, looking at something over her shoulder. A low, menacing sound filled the air. A sound that started as a hum and grew into a roar. It was the sound of dozens of war cries, echoing from the hills around them. Dakota. The hunt was over, and the warriors had come home. They descended on the camp like a storm, a whirlwind of righteous fury. The tables turned in an instant. The raiders, who had been tormentors moments before, were now the prey. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Patterson, seeing his men falling around him, became desperate. He held Nalnish up as a shield, pressing a knife to the boy's throat. "Stay back," he screamed, "or the boy dies." The warriors froze. Dakota stood 20 feet away, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with a murderous light. Evangeline walked forward, her steps slow and deliberate, until she stood directly in front of Patterson. The terrified woman from Cedar Ridge was gone forever. In her place was Atama, the flame woman, and her eyes were as cold as a winter lake. "You are a coward, Jim Patterson," she said, her voice calm and clear, cutting through the tense silence. "You hide behind a child because you are afraid to face a man." "Shut up!" he shrieked, his eyes darting around wildly. "You hunted me for years," she continued, her voice hypnotic, drawing his focus. "You thought you were hunting a broken little thing you could own, but you weren't. You were hunting a ghost. The woman you wanted to buy died a long time ago. I am what grew from her ashes." She took another step closer. "You want to know what I learned out here? I learned that a man's body can be poisoned. I learned that Thomas didn't just hate me. He was poisoning me, for years, to keep me weak, to make me barren." A ripple of shock went through the captured raiders. They were brutes, but this was a different kind of evil. They looked from her to Patterson, their expressions changing. "You're lying," Patterson stammered, but his conviction was gone. "Am I?" Evangeline said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He made me a healer, Patterson. I know more about poisons than you know about breathing. I could kill you with a single scratch from a thorn. I could make you sick for the rest of your short, miserable life. I could make your own body betray you, just like he did to me." She took one final step, so close she could smell his sour sweat. She looked past him, at his men. "He made a deal with a man who poisoned his own wife. Is this the man you follow?" In that moment of hesitation, as Patterson's eyes were locked on hers, Dakota moved. He was a blur, a streak of motion. He wasn't aiming for Patterson. He threw his hatchet with perfect, deadly accuracy at Patterson's knife hand. The blade spun through the air and embedded itself in Patterson's wrist. He screamed, a high, piercing shriek, and dropped the knife. Nalnish tumbled free, and Laughing Crow, who had been creeping up from the side, snatched the boy and scrambled back to safety. Patterson was on his knees, howling, clutching his ruined hand. The fight was over. His men threw down their weapons. their will to fight broken not by the warriors, but by the quiet, terrifying words of the Flame Woman. Justice was not swift. It was deliberate. Patterson and his men were bound and kept under guard. The Council of Elders, led by Iona, met to decide their fate. Evangeline was called to speak. She did not call for their deaths. That was too easy, too clean. For his men, she said, her voice ringing with authority, let them see the truth. Let them go back to their world and tell the story of Thomas Molly, the man who poisoned his wife because he was a coward. Let his name be a curse in his own town. And for Patterson? Iona asked. Evangeline looked at the pathetic, whimpering man who had haunted her for so long. He wanted to own me, she said. He wanted to break me. He doesn't deserve a warrior's death. He deserves to be nothing. Strip him of his weapons, his horse, his boots. Leave him with one water skin. Let the prairie he thought he could conquer be his judge. Let him walk home. It was a sentence worse than death, a slow, agonizing reckoning with the vast, indifferent wilderness. The next morning, his men were sent back with their story, and Jim Patterson, stripped of everything, was pointed east and forced to walk. He stumbled a few steps, looked back with eyes full of terror and hate, and then began his long, hopeless journey. He was never seen again. Years passed. Her sons grew into strong, wise young men. Koshi, the thinker, Amakia, the warrior, Nalnish, the leader. The story of Itama, the flame woman who had faced down her own demons and brought a monster to his knees, became a legend among the people. She was a symbol of transformation, a testament to the idea that the deepest wounds can forge the greatest strength. One day a visitor arrived at their camp, a soldier from a nearby fort riding under a flag of truce. He brought a message. The town of Cedar Ridge was dying. A sickness, a lung fever, was sweeping through it, and their doctor had no cure. People were dying every day. They had heard stories from trappers and traders, stories of a powerful Comanche medicine woman, a white woman with red hair, who could work miracles with herbs. They were begging for her help. The irony was staggering. The town that had cast her out, that had watched silently as she was about to be sold, was now on its knees, begging her to save them. The elders said it was not their fight. Dakota said he would support any choice she made. Her sons looked at her, their eyes full of questions. Could she go back? Could she face the ghosts of that terrible place? She looked at her family, at the life she had built from the ashes of her old one. She was not that broken girl anymore. She was a Tama, and a healer's duty is to heal, not for vengeance, not for pride, but because it is who she is. I will go, she announced. She rode into Cedar Ridge not as a victim, but as a queen. Flanked by her 3 tall, proud sons and Dakota, she was a vision of power and grace. The townspeople who were not sick stumbled from their homes, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief. They saw the barren girl, returned as a savior. The town was a shadow of its former self, filled with the sounds of coughing and weeping. She went to work immediately, her sons helping her gather the herbs she needed. She set up a field hospital in the abandoned church, brewing teas and making poultices, her hands moving with a confidence that left the townspeople in awe. On the second day, a woman approached her, her face gaunt. It was Mrs. Henderson, the town's chief gossip. You came back, the woman whispered, her voice hoarse. Sickness does not care about old whispers, Evangeline replied, not unkindly, as she handed the woman a cup of healing tea. She finally saw Thomas. He was in their old house, lying on the same bed where he had snored his drunken snores. He was skeletal, his skin pale and translucent, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The sickness had him in its final grip. She sat by his bed, and his dull eyes fluttered open. He recognized her. A flicker of fear, then shame crossed his face. Evangeline, he rasped, you are an angel. No, Thomas, she said softly. I'm just a woman you underestimated. She didn't try to heal him. It was too late. But she stayed with him. In his delirium, he confessed everything. The poison. He hadn't hated her. He sobbed. He had been terrified. Terrified that her beauty would attract another man, a better man, and she would leave him. So he decided to make her sick, to make her dependent, to break her wings so she could never fly away. It wasn't malice. It was a pathetic, cowardly weakness that had festered into evil. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness was a gift he hadn't earned. But in his final wheezing confession, she found a strange, hollow sort of peace. He died near dawn, not a monster, but just a small, sad man, consumed by his own fear. Evangeline saved Cedar Ridge. When the last of the fever had passed, she turned her back on the town for the final time, leaving them with their lives, their shame, and the legend of the barren woman who had become their salvation. She rode back into the prairie, back to her home, her family, her life. The turquoise bird Dakota had given her still hung around her neck. It was no longer a symbol of escape, but a symbol of the soaring, boundless freedom of a spirit that had found its true place in the world. The woman they called Barren had become a mother to a legend. Her legacy was not in her womb, but in her will, a testament to the power of choosing your own worth, even when the world tells you that you have none. What would you have done? Would you have had the courage to take Dakota's hand and step into the unknown? Or would you have stayed, accepting the hell you knew over a freedom you couldn't imagine? These stories force us to look at the cages we build for ourselves, and the keys we're too afraid to turn. If you believe that our greatest strengths are often forged in the fires of our deepest wounds, then you understand why we tell these stories. They remind us that we have the power to rewrite our own legends. Your support helps us share these tales of resilience and transformation with the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another journey into the heart of what it means to be human. What story of transformation are you living right now? Let us know in the comments below.